Why hello everybody! The year is 2024, and these days 9 out of 10 dentists recommend a tier list for all your communication needs. Someone give you a blasphemous pizza topping opinion? Hit him back with a tier list. Struggling in a world full of bad thoughts on fruit? Shoot him a tier list. Met with some particularly awful anime takes? Tier list. Last August, I released a tier list video about all the video games I played in 2022, and it was met with universal acclaim. None of my opinions drew any ire whatsoever. So, of course, I'm doing it again, though still as late in the year as last time. I had a couple strategies to ensure a more timely release date, but unfortunately all of those fell apart when it came to... Sorry about that. First off, an introduction to this year's games. I completed 10 games this year, ranging from some massive AAA titles like The Last of Us Part 2, to game expansions like Bowser's Fury, to shorter indie titles like Firewatch. There's a good variety of genres here too. Shooters, action-adventure, and walking sims are all here. Like last year, although this is labeled as a 2023 games tier list, that doesn't mean the scope of this list is contained to just games that came out in 2023. Now, this year's list doesn't have as many retro games as last year's. All of these came out in the last decade, though there are a couple of remakes and remasters of older games. And just like last year, these games are being ranked against each other instead of against every game I've ever played. If I did that, A tier would have 5 games and C tier would probably be empty, so it's a necessary evil. Once again, there are 4 key points I looked at while ranking these games. Number 1 is, of course, the gameplay. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Is it fun? Is there depth to the game? Does it have a meaningful sense of progression? Considering this list consists of video games, this category is particularly important to my ranking. Next up is the story. I love me a good, compelling story in a video game. This medium in particular has some really great opportunities for immersive storytelling. Beyond just being fun and interesting though, I'm really looking for stories that have something to say, that leave me with some sort of larger philosophy once the credits roll. It's also very important to me that loot or narrative dissonance is avoided if possible. If the gameplay and the story don't mesh well together, that's a problem in my book. Although I'll be discussing plot for most of these games, I'll try and avoid spoilers as much as I can. The next criteria is music. I'm a big sucker for video game soundtracks, and this is the topic I fully intend to nerd out about throughout this list. Thankfully, this was a good year for game music in my experience. 7 of the 10 games I'm going to talk about were serious frontrunners for my favorite soundtrack, so I'm adding a little wrinkle in this category. Not only do I want to hear a game full of memorable tunes, I also want to hear some larger musical storytelling. This can be done through themes and motifs, instrumentation, or just some carefully selected licensed songs. No matter how it's done, I'm looking for games with soundtracks that are memorable and meaningful. The last criteria is once again presentation. For this, I'm looking at visuals, UI, sound design, and all of those little things that go into making a game feel great to play. Among these 4 criteria, gameplay, story, music, and presentation, there are 12 medals up for grabs to award my favorites in each category. Alright, that's enough yapping for me. Let's get started with game number 1. First up, I'm going to start with a very, very hot take. I didn't really care for What Remains of Edith Finch. This game has won award after award, has a perfect 10 on Steam, and has been repeatedly cited as an example of video games as an art form. Following all that praise, I was feeling optimistic when I first jumped into Edith Finch, but it didn't even take an hour before I realized I wasn't enjoying just about any of it. This game follows the journal of Edith, the last surviving member of the Finch family, as she walks through her old home and reminisces on the lives, and more importantly, the deaths of her family. In between sections while you're walking around the house as Edith, you also get the chance to see how each Finch died from their point of view. The gameplay is really varied here. One section early on shows you the death of 10-year-old Molly Finch, where you play as several hungry predators hunting down food to satiate their own appetite, before Molly herself is killed from eating poisoned berries. Another section has you playing as a teenage Barbara Finch inside of a horror comic, trying to defend herself amidst home intruders and radio announcements warning of a killer on the loose, all complete with a delightfully cheesy narrator.
Old Jack here with another ghastly tale.
While I absolutely applaud this game for all the different things it tries, there's an immediate problem. The gameplay here is a mile wide, but only an inch deep. There's zero player agency here. Your actions lack any urgency or consequence in service of the story. It's more of a theme park ride than a video game in that sense. Beyond that issue though, not all of the minigames here were made equal. Walter Finch's story has you living the life of a recluse, opening up cans of peaches, several times. And then he gets run over by a train. There's also Sam Finch's story where you need to take pictures of various things, which was mostly fine until this screen where you have to take a picture of a hidden deer. This took me about 8 minutes to find, and although it might just be a skill issue, any momentum this section had going for it immediately vanished after that moment. But here's the thing, Edith Finch is, at its core, a narrative-based walking simulator, and the gameplay isn't really the star of the show here, so as long as the story's good, maybe it should get a pass, right? Let's talk about the story. I don't think it's bad per se, but I'm not sure I got what all the fuss was about. The structure of Edith Finch feels like a collection of short fairy tales, as we do a lightning round through all of the other Finch's deaths. There is some connective tissue throughout the whole game, but a lot of it is buried in the detail of the environments rather than what you, the player, are probably focusing on. Edith isn't also the most reliable narrator. She's quite naive into what's really going on with the Finch's family curse, leaving you to piece everything together yourself. While I can appreciate that this game forces you to think critically about everything you've seen or been told, I don't know if the appreciation I gained for the story days after beating it was worth the feeling of ambivalence I had once the credits began to roll. Another issue I had with the game's story is how easy it is to spoil the most emotional moment for yourself. For fear of spoilers, I don't want to say how, but there's something you can do very easily to suss out some information that is otherwise mostly fed to you at the end of the story, and that was a tad disappointing. I wasn't robbed of all surprises when playing Edith Finch, thankfully. The sequence towards the end where you play as Lewis Finch is absolutely the highlight of the game. The gameplay in that section is actually fun, and Lewis's story is one that has really stuck with me after playing. On the music front, there isn't much to report here. Jeff Russo's piano-driven score for this game is appropriately dreary, although I found that the music he didn't write for the game ended up being far more notable. The random bits of classical music like Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers during Gregory's story, and the Michael Myers theme from Dead by Daylight, Halloween, and Barbara's story stood out a lot more. Still, the original music made for this game is pleasant if nothing else. I definitely want to give Edith Finch props in the presentation department though. The visuals are gorgeous, especially considering the game was made by such a small team. And I love the visual direction with the subtitles. The changes in typeface for certain characters and the way the subtitles become part of the story every now and then is really cool. In the end, I don't think What Remains of Edith Finch is bad. This tier list notably lacks an F tier after all, but I don't know if I can say it's that great either. Clearly, I'm in the minority here, and that's alright. I'm glad others seem to get something out of this game when I wasn't able to. It could be a media literacy problem on my end, or maybe I just need to play more walking sims. Either way, I think my opinion on this next game will be a lot more popular. Let's check it out. Before I say anything about this game, I want to supply you with some perspective on my gaming tastes. In the past, I've mostly played single-player games on Nintendo platforms, and until I started playing Overwatch 2, the only shooters I had ever extensively played were the games in the Splatoon series. As a result, what I'm going to say during this segment is from the perspective of A, a newbie to mainstream shooters, and B, a newbie to free-to-play live service games. I got into Overwatch 2 because it's the game of choice for a lot of my friends, and I really tried my best to go into this game with an open mind, despite my less than positive thoughts on the game's developers. Overwatch 2 is a free-to-play multiplayer shooter featuring a diverse roster of colorful characters set in the future, where humans live alongside sentient robots, the Omnics, to a reasonable degree of peace. Sometimes. The core PvP features a few different game modes, such as Control Point, one-way push the objective, one-way control point, two-way push the objective, control point then push the objective, lots of control points, and an upcoming game mode, Tug of War, Control Points. Yeah, there isn't much meaningful diversity when it comes to the core game modes. They are really a backdrop to lift up the shooting aspect of the game. As a result though, matches start to feel largely the same sometimes. It really makes me question whether these different game modes are doing much of anything. Thankfully, there's one big feature of Overwatch that can help different matches feel fresh: the role system. There are 3 roles in Overwatch 2, each with a different pool of characters to choose from. Tanks like Reinhardt and D.Va anchor the team, with a larger pool of HP and abilities to mitigate oncoming damage, protecting themselves and their team. Then there are the damage characters like Soldier and Cassidy, whose abilities are largely focused on dealing damage to the other team and getting kills. Last, there's the supports, a group of characters who keep their teams alive with healing abilities, while often providing other utility, such as Lucio's speed boost or Mercy's damage boost. I really do like these different roles. While the game modes fail to provide much variety, switching roles between matches can help prevent Overwatch fatigue. Playing tank requires you to think differently than support, which in turn demands a different mindset than DPS, and I think that's great. The division of these roles has led to a few balancing issues, but since I don't care about Overwatch competitively, there's no need to comment on that. My issues more so lie with specific characters. First off, I really hate that certain heroes can one-shot kill you in several circumstances. Overwatch isn't like Splatoon where you can die and be back in the action in roughly 12 seconds. Dying comes with a pretty hefty consequence, 10 seconds of a death cam, followed by whatever time it takes for you to walk back to the action, which can take a better part of a minute sometimes. So it really sucks when you're playing the game and you're unexpectedly headshot with no warning by a Widowmaker. You'll be sitting out of the game for the next 30 seconds minimum, asking yourself what you could have done in that situation. There's also the matter of Sombra, a character who can invisibly assault your backline and lock you out of your own abilities, including Soldier's ability to run somehow? Prior to a patch late in the year, Sombra also had the ability to teleport halfway across the map whenever she felt like it, allowing her to escape situations she really shouldn't be able to. To my understanding, Sombra has never really been considered high tier, but that doesn't mean she isn't dreadful to play against in the lower ranks. I think there are a few more heroes that are pretty unfun to play against, but Sombra is the best at making the game miserable. There's also the matter of some abilities where the counterplay isn't very intuitive. I think D.Va's ultimate is probably the shining example of this. If you've never played Overwatch before, consider this question. If you're next to a massive bomb, would you be safer A, a good distance away but still in line of sight, or B, 5 feet away but behind a car? Turns out that car will nullify all the damage, but having some distance can still get you killed. It's a very unique game design choice, I guess. Queue times for this game can also get quite long sometimes, especially if you're queuing with friends. I've honestly lost count of how many times I've had to wait over 5 minutes to get in a game. At the time of writing, my PS5 says I have 228 hours in Overwatch, but only 164 of those hours were actually spent playing the game. That's nearly 3 days worth of time spent in Overwatch 2 outside of matches, playing Deathmatch, Genji Ball, and Dead by Daylight instead of the core PvP. And this thing is maybe more of a personal problem, but I'm kind of shocked that Overwatch still has no option for gyro aim in the year 2023. It seems as though players of console shooters agree that gyro is leaps and bounds ahead of dual stick years ago, so it kind of sucks that Blizzard has been dragging their feet on gyro implementation on PS5 for so long, despite that feature being ready at launch for the Switch version. That concludes my thoughts on the core PvP. Now it's time to get into the most offensive problem of Overwatch 2, the monetization. While it's a free-to-play game, Blizzard really wants to suck your wallet dry. First off, there's a battle pass for each season. Completing it without paying will yield you very little, maybe a skin or two, an emote, a highlight intro, and some voice lines. Other than that, you'll end up with a lot of junk. Tiny trinkets for your weapon that nobody will ever see, poses that show up during the 2-second victory screen, and meaningless little icons for your profile. If you choose to pay $10 for the battle pass, you'll get a little more, including some skins, although the quality of the battle pass skins usually fluctuates a lot. It's clear Blizzard wants to save the best skins for the shop so you can spend even more money. I've been repeatedly let down to see that some of the best looking skins in each new season's trailer aren't included in the battle pass at all. This was especially bad in Season 7. It felt like half the marketing focused on this skin for Moira, which you couldn't get unless you spent $40? What? Let's talk pricing for a second. Most of the new skins made for the shop cost around $20, which is absurd to pay for a 3D model that you won't even be able to see yourself since Overwatch is a first-person game. That money could easily be spent on something more worthwhile, like an indie game or something. And hey, if you did that, you would also be giving your money to better people than Blizzard Entertainment. This company does not deserve your financial support. But even beyond the skins, everything seems to cost more than it's really worth. When Overwatch 2 came out, there were headlines about one of those tiny weapon charms costing $7, while you could buy a real-world keychain of that charm for just $5. That's pure insanity right there. Now, you can also earn some in-game credits by playing the game, but there are some caveats. Starting with Season 3, you can earn legacy credits through the Battle Pass, but those don't work on stuff in the shop, only cosmetics from Overwatch 1 and a very limited selection of new Overwatch 2 cosmetics. You can also earn up to 50 coins, which do work for the shop, by completing all 11 of your weekly challenges. This can take a while. You'll need to play a lot of matches in 1 week to get these 50 coins, and the reward doesn't really match the effort. To afford just one new shop skin, you'll need to complete all your weeklies for the better part of a year. When Blizzard introduced a progression system in August 2023, I was hopeful that maybe they were gearing up to rectify this issue. But no, there aren't really any meaningful rewards for leveling up, making it a largely frivolous addition. You might think, surely he can't be serious. Surely there's a quicker way to gain in-game currency. And you'd be right. It's time for another quiz. Is it faster to gain Overwatch coins by A, playing the game Overwatch 2, or B, using the Bing search engine? If you selected B, unfortunately, you're right. Before the Microsoft Rewards program was gutted in December 2023, you could earn about 350 rewards points a day for just about 5 minutes of work. Redeem 1,800 points, about what you'd get in 5 to 6 days, and you'll have just made the same amount of coins as you would have gotten for completing 4 weeks of challenges in Overwatch 2. There's zero excuse here. Somehow Blizzard's incessant fixation on monetization has gotten people nostalgic for loot boxes, because gambling honestly might be better than this. You have to wonder where Blizzard's priorities lie. Do they really want to make a fun game? Or was Overwatch 2 made to suck your bank account dry?
Our main goal for Overwatch 2 is striving to make PvP gameplay more rewarding and more fun.
One of the biggest appeals of Overwatch is the world and the characters. The diverse roster of heroes is definitely a strength. They've done a good job giving these characters distinct personalities and designs. Some are better than others though. Overwatch's poster girl, Tracer, can be particularly annoying at times.
It's called a marathon, but once I do it, they'll call it a Tracer-thon. Yeah!
I also appreciate the varied interaction these characters have with one another. There are a bunch of fun little conversations they can have before or during matches. They really help this cast feel alive. Unfortunately, I can't share the same praise with the overall world and story. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Overwatch 2 lore, from the Omnic Crisis, the formation of Overwatch, Blackwatch, Talon, the Deadlock Gang, Null Sector, and that's barely scratching the surface of this world. There's kind of a big problem here though. The actual core game of Overwatch 2 feels incredibly detached from this world. Mortal enemies like Widowmaker and Mercy have zero reason to be teaming up together lore-wise, especially for missions such as making a robot push this barrier across Rome. It feels like there's no in-universe justification for the PvP existing. Obviously, I'm not looking for perfect lore justifications for everything in this game, like I don't think there needs to be a real reason why Lucio Ball exists, but for there to be ludonarrative dissonance for the flagship modes of the game, I think that's a bit of a problem. There's maybe a bigger problem here though. Almost all of the story content and world building of Overwatch 2 is not actually present in the game Overwatch 2. Instead, it's in animated shorts on YouTube, online comics, novellas, among other things. And heck, I've actually been pretty impressed by what I've seen in some of these things, especially the animated shorts. But it still irks me that the story of Overwatch 2 isn't actually present in the game, excluding these 3 short PvP missions that cost $10 that I didn't really care to actually play because I had long given up on Overwatch by that point. If what interests you most about this game is the characters or the world, you'll gain nothing by actually playing. The music of Overwatch 2 follows a similar trend. The best stuff in the soundtrack is not what you'll hear in-game. Matches are mostly silent, save for a brief bit of music when a team is about to win. So instead, the soundtrack albums are filled with music from the YouTube animated shorts and themes from each map. The highlights in this soundtrack tend to be the map themes, however, they only play for 20 to 30 seconds, cutting out some of the best stuff. I was blown away when I first heard this violin solo in Antarctic Peninsula, and it annoys me to no end that they couldn't let this play in-game. In terms of presentation, I don't know if I have a ton to say. At the very least, I appreciate some aspects of the art direction because there are some pretty cool looking skins here. The sound design is also pretty good across the board. A special shout out goes out to that dink sound when you headshot someone. It's incredibly satisfying to hear. Unfortunately, the UI isn't spectacular on console, and sometimes it's even a bit glitchy. Spectator mode on PS5 has been a pain to use ever since I started playing in January 2023, and at this point I don't know if they're ever going to fix it. And so we finally reached the end of the Overwatch 2 section. I have many problems with this game, hopefully evident by the overwhelming length of this segment. And yet, it isn't last on this list, nor is it F tier. If I really, truly hated everything about this game, I don't think I would have over 200 hours in it. Even if I've drastically pulled back my playtime since starting, there's clearly something that keeps me going in Overwatch 2, even if it's only because I'm playing it with my friends. I hate to admit it, but every now and then I do start having a bit of fun in this game, and I suppose that counts for something. So for now, Overwatch 2 can enjoy a spot in D tier, and we can keep moving up the list. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a game that I desperately wanted to enjoy. I've been paying attention to it for years, ever since Cloud became my main in Smash 4. When it finally came out in 2020, I watched countless streamers play through the opening hours of the game, and it was ultimately one of the top reasons why I wanted to get a PS5. But I don't think it lived up to the hype. First off, I should mention that I had never played any Final Fantasy game until 7 Remake, including the original Final Fantasy VII, and I think I made a big mistake by starting here. This game, in several ways, does not make much attempt to cater to newcomers. FF7 Remake is the first in a trilogy of games loosely adapting the story of Final Fantasy VII in a modern style. Since this is the first game in the trilogy, it only covers about the first 5 hours of the original FF7, stretching out those 5 hours into a 30-hour adventure. Lots of attempts are made to flesh out brief sequences and minor characters from the original. One example is in Chapter 4, where you learn about the backstory of Jessie, a relatively unimportant side character. She doesn't really add much to the overall story. The pacing of Final Fantasy VII Remake is all over the place due to these unnecessary sequences. It feels like they exist to delight fans of the original game instead of to add to the story or the gameplay. While I do like how some of these sections from the original game have been fleshed out, Wall Market is a notable highlight. Many other chapters, especially Chapter 10 in the sewers and Chapter 11 in the train yard, make Final Fantasy VII Remake feel bloated. I genuinely thought about giving up during those chapters. They are mind-numbingly dull from both a gameplay and story perspective. As for the story itself, it's fine. Anyone who has paid attention to FF7 Remake knows it isn't a one-to-one retelling of the original. In fact, it diverts from the original in several ways. I liked the 4 main characters well enough. They're all unique and interesting, but I don't think the events they go through are all that memorable. Other than the chapters I've already mentioned, I can't really remember much of the story other than the beginning and the ending. The middle is a blur to me, maybe because so much of it feels like pointless filler. There was also a lot of tonal whiplash. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a funny game a lot of the time. There's a status effect that turns you into a frog, a silly little dude who can one-shot you, a boss fight against a giant murderous house, and Cloud's hilariously out-of-character dancing minigame. And I love all of that, but sometimes that humor seeps into the story in its most serious moments, robbing those scenes of any emotional value. Some examples are during his death, when Cloud says,
"You owe me a pizza."
And during the tense scene where Shinra drops the plate on Sector 7 and kills thousands of people, when this random cat shows up out of nowhere. What should have been a terrifying scene was made immediately funny when this thing showed up. Now, on to gameplay. Final Fantasy VII is an action RPG, but in an interesting twist, it borrows a lot of ideas from turn-based RPGs like the original FF7. While slicing and dicing as Cloud, you can effectively pause time to cast a spell, get healed up, or revive an ally. It's an interesting concept on paper, and I was enjoying the combat at first, but towards the end of the game, I started to notice an issue I was having. I think having time pause so frequently during battle for menuing saps a lot of the energy these fights should have had. I understand that you can configure button combos to instantly trigger spells, but there are only 4 slots for that, and I tended to use builds that were a lot more versatile than just using the same 4 actions. Another issue I had with combat specifically pertains to bosses, the stagger mechanic. All enemies, not just the bosses, have a fairly bulky defense unless you can attack them enough with the right spells to stagger them, which I don't mind. However, for the bosses, even hitting them with the right spells would barely affect their stagger meter. During specific boss fights, notably Eligor in Chapter 11, it felt like I would have to attack for several minutes, doing effectively 0 damage just to get the boss to stagger, which would last about 10 seconds before I would have to spend another 5 minutes on the next stagger. These boss fights were too long for their own good, especially when it felt like I wasn't doing anything to their health bar most of the time. Thankfully, I felt the final boss was pretty good. That brief section at the beginning, where you're just going at it one-on-one with no party members to back you up, was exhilarating. Even in this fight though, a problem emerged. The battle system of FF7 Remake only allows for 3 active party members fighting at once, despite there being 4 playable characters. The game is usually able to mitigate this issue by letting the story mandate which combo of characters you'll have for each boss. For the final boss, however, the characters you get are random. At that time, I had only finished solid materia builds for Cloud, Aerith, and Tifa. Thankfully, the game didn't give me Barret during the final fight, but if it had, I would have lost instantly. I'm very surprised why the game doesn't let you select your party for the final boss fight. Combat aside, I also wasn't too impressed with the gameplay out of combat either. Cloud is stiff and uncomfortable to control. He turns in incredibly wide angles, not befitting a lot of the narrow and cramped level design in Midgar. And that level design really isn't compatible with the party of characters that constantly get in your way and refuse to move. Cloud will be able to run at points, and at other times he'll be walking the speed of an inchworm, his speed always out of the player's control. When you want to slice open crates to find items, Cloud will stop running, slice once, and sheath his sword before letting you run around again. Why does he put his sword back every time? It makes opening 3 crates feel like it takes 3 years. Another issue I have is with these blue arrows that show up every 2 seconds to stop your movement so you can enter a really slow animation. This blue arrow section with Tifa hopping around the Shinra building was the absolute worst. Also, the side quests in this game aren't anything to write home about. Some are better than others, but I think your enjoyment of these hinges on how much you like this world and these characters. One thing that I can give Final Fantasy VII Remake is that it's really pretty. The character models look great in cutscenes, and all around, the world of Midgar is visually striking. But what I really want to praise here is the music. Other than the theme to Super Smash Bros. Brawl, this is my introduction to Nobuo Uematsu's work, and I have to say, the work he did in the original FF7 is just phenomenal. It's full of memorable area themes, pounding battle tracks, and lovely motifs that carry throughout the score. And I'm more than happy to report that the new soundtrack in FF7 Remake lives up to its legacy. The insane music team over at Square Enix did so much to build on Uematsu's work, with new orchestrations, variations on motifs, and even a few new tunes to supplement the original music. There's a lot of great stuff to shout out here. Too much, honestly, so here's a list of all my favorites. I want to specifically point out 3 though. Chapter 9 follows Cloud and Aerith to the bustling town of Woolmarket. This first track, Midnight Rendezvous, plays as they leave the Sector 5 slums. This track is so enchanting, and it's a great way to start off the best chapter in the game. Next on their journey is the collapsed expressway, full of enemies and robot hands. It keeps up with that same enchanting energy, but now with a more lively atmosphere. If you happen to run into enemies during this section, we hit High Five, one of my favorite tracks in the game. I was not expecting a battle theme like this to suddenly show up, but I am so happy it's here. I didn't go into the musical storytelling aspect of this soundtrack much, but it's here. This soundtrack expertly interweaves the FF7 theme, Aerith's theme, the Shinra motif, and One Winged Angel, among other melodies, together in so many dynamic and interesting ways. So even if I didn't enjoy Final Fantasy VII Remake all that much, I have no reservations in handing it the first medal of the video, the bronze for music. In the end, my first foray into the Final Fantasy series didn't go as well as I'd hoped. I really tried to enjoy this game, but during some sections, it was pretty hard to find a reason to keep going. I'm glad I finished it at the very least, but I don't know if I'm all that interested in the next game in the trilogy. Anyway, on to a series I'm much more familiar with. I love 3D Mario. Not many other series can boast consistent bangers. Even the weaker entries like 3D Land are so fun and imaginative that they clear most other games on the market. So of course I was ecstatic to see that 3D World from the Wii U was getting new content with the Switch port, an entirely new campaign called Bowser's Fury. Bowser's Fury might be the most experimental 3D Mario yet. For the first time in the series, there's no level select or world map. Instead, everything takes place on one world, Lake Lapcat, which is filled with the main platforming challenges along with little secrets for you to find on your way to track down all 100 cat shines. Since Bowser's Fury is an offshoot of 3D World, you have access to all of Mario's movement and power-ups from that game, but in a brand new context. It was such a pleasure seeing the return of all the great gimmicks from 3D World, like the clear pipes, the ice skate, and, of course, Plessy, who originally only showed up in specific levels but has now become your primary mode of transportation around the islands of Lake Lapcat. The core platforming challenges are naturally fantastic. It's 3D Mario after all. Each stage explores a different mechanic, power-up, or combination thereof, and they keep throwing new ideas at you as you travel throughout the different islands. But even outside of the main stuff, there's a lot to do on Lake Lapcat to find cat shines, from obstacle courses to complete with Plessy, rabbits to catch, and lost kittens who need an escort. It appears there's so much diversity in Bowser's Fury that it can't possibly get old. And yet, it didn't take long before I realized how much stuff gets reused in between levels. Each core level has 5 cat shines to find. The first mission is always just to get to the end. Those are typically the best. But once you leave the area and come back, chances are high that your next mission is going to be to collect 5 cat shine shards across the stage, or to find a key at the end of the map and escort it to the start. There are some more varied missions from time to time, but those two, along with another I'll talk about later, seemed to show up at every island at some point, and I really wish they weren't as frequent. Mario games are best when they're constantly tossing new ideas at you, and those missions really missed the mark for me. But that's not all there is to Bowser's Fury, far from it in fact. At the center of Lake Lapcat is Bowser's shell, engulfed in a weird black goo. It won't seem to do much at first, but spend enough time platforming and swimming on the lake and Bowser will wake up. When Bowser is in Fury mode, he'll constantly try to attack you, breathing fire at Mario, turning the cats evil, and raining down rocks. Sometimes he'll actually help you in ways. Those rocks can sometimes serve as temporary platforms to use in levels, or in a case like Trickety Tower, where there are invisible walls, those rocks can help you find your way around. Fury mode is a limited time event. You can end it by collecting a cat shine or waiting for Bowser to go away on his own. While it's a cool idea, I'm not sure if the implementation of Bowser's Fury into this open-world Mario game works that well. Often, Bowser is an unwelcome nuisance, adding artificial difficulty to levels rather than changing how you play. I think having some of the rocks help you out is interesting, and I want to see more of that rather than him randomly showing up to ruin my run of Crisp Climb Castle. However, Bowser is often a necessary nuisance because of these Bowser blocks. Every main level has one cat shine hidden behind these things, which can only be destroyed by Bowser during Fury mode. Because I chose to 100% Bowser's Fury, I had to spend a lot of time sitting around and waiting for him to get mad, which could take a few minutes on some occasions. I really don't like those cat shines, and frankly, this game would be better if they weren't there at all. There is one final way to end Fury mode. Once you collect enough cat shines, you can finally use a Giga Bell, which turns Mario into a massive kaiju cat, beginning a boss fight that takes place over the entirety of Lake Lapcat. These sequences are so cool. Despite some dead spaces in the fight where you might sometimes be unable to attack Bowser and vice versa, these fights are intense. Some of the best sequences in 3D Mario. Despite my gripes, I was having a fun enough time exploring the islands of Lake Lapcat, collecting every possible cat shine I could along the way, when the game suddenly told me that Bowser was about to go into Fury mode permanently unless I finished collecting 50 cat shines to unlock the final Giga Bell, thus beginning the ending sequence to Bowser's Fury. I'm a bit confused why the game forces you to beat it, especially as someone who was combing through the game in search of all the cat shines. There were several major islands I hadn't even been to yet. As Tellis on Reddit so eloquently put it, it's like you're eating a nice meal, then halfway through someone brings out dessert, but after finishing that you have to go back to your normal meal to finish it off and it's just not the same. Of course there's not much story here, it's a Mario game that isn't one of these, so there's not much to talk about there. There's plenty on the music front though. 3D World is easily one of my favorite Mario soundtracks, and while the original music team for 3D World seems to have moved on to other projects, the new composer, Daisuke Matsuoka, did a great job of matching the vibe of the base game's music. Lake Lapcat has this gorgeous theme, harkening back to the Mario soundtracks of the early 2010s. But then you enter a level, and you get a silly little tune like Pounce Bounce Isle, blending guitar, bass, shaker, violin, flute, and trombone together into something delightful. I love the contrast the normal level themes have against the Fury sections. One minute it'll be a small ensemble of acoustic instruments until Bowser shows up and tears through the noise with a crazy metal anthem. Unfortunately, there's very little thematic material here past a few quotations of some motifs from 3D World, so Bowser's Fury isn't winning on music metal, but I think it seriously deserves an honorable mention. This soundtrack is so much fun to listen to. As a whole, I don't know if Bowser's Fury is a game I can recommend to just everyone. It's 3D Mario at its most experimental, and while a lot of it works, there are still some kinks to be ironed out. If you've never played 3D World before, this is an absolutely killer bundle, but I'm not sure if Bowser's Fury on its own is really worth the purchase. Still, it was fun, and I'm absolutely looking forward to the future of the 3D Mario series. I wasn't originally planning to play Firewatch this year, but after having a bad experience with Edith Finch, I wanted to play another popular walking simulator for some perspective, to see if I disliked the genre as a whole, or whether it was specifically Edith Finch that I didn't like. And I'm very happy to report that Firewatch was a far more pleasant time for me. In Firewatch, you play as Henry, a newly appointed fire lookout in Wyoming's Shoshone National Forest. Henry's tower is deep in the forest, miles away from civilization, but he does have this radio. At the other end is Delilah, Henry's supervisor, and his only emotional lifeline out in the Shoshone. Apart from her, it's just Henry in the wilderness, or so he thinks. As Henry and Delilah strike up conversation and begin to learn more about each other, mysterious things start to occur, and the two begin to get wrapped up in a larger mystery about what's been going on in the Shoshone. There's not a ton I can offer story-wise without giving away spoilers, but I think Firewatch is such an incredibly well-written narrative. It keeps you on your toes and doesn't end in the way you'd expect. The conclusion to Firewatch has proven to be pretty divisive over the years, but I love it. It works on so many levels thematically, and it really resonated with me as the credits began to roll, even if it does feel like a bit of an anticlimax. One of my favorite gaming memories from 2023 was when I finally connected the dots and figured out what Firewatch was trying to say, and the ending tied a neat little bow on a great story. Since your only contact with civilization is Delilah, the story is very dependent on Henry's dialogue with her, and I'm happy to report that the writers knocked it out of the park. Henry and Delilah's conversations are so genuinely enthralling to listen to, and at their core, both characters feel so alive and human. And while the script is really astounding, what blew me away are the voice performances from Rich Sommer and Cissy Jones. Voice acting in video games can feel so melodramatic sometimes, and while I don't think that's a bad thing, I love the Xenoblade series after all, what really stood out to me about Sommer and Jones's performance were how real they felt, something that really helped me get attached to and invested in these characters.
I don't think there's any fictional character I hate more than Forrest Burns.
Henry, as an employee of the Forest Service, that is treason.
The voice work in Firewatch is just the cherry on top to a fantastic story, one that I think really deserves the bronze medal. As far as gameplay goes, Firewatch is a narrative-centric walking simulator, so there isn't much to talk about here. Navigating the forest with just your map and a compass does require a little bit of skill though, which already makes the gameplay more engaging than Edith Finch. You do also have a degree of agency when it comes to Henry's interactions with Delilah through this dialogue tree, although because Firewatch only has one ending, your choices don't affect much beyond a bit of alternate dialogue. I do wish that the dialogue options were a little more important, honestly. It's kind of cool that you can choose to ignore Delilah or anger her to the point where she won't answer her radio, but Henry's relationship with Delilah ultimately turns into the same thing no matter what you do, which is a bit of a letdown. On the music front, Firewatch is alright. It's an introspective, character-driven story taking place in the wilderness, so I wasn't expecting much out of the soundtrack. The conscious lack of music in many areas makes the rare times where music plays impactful though, and I love that. There is one great moment I want to touch on at the end of the game, when the track Thoroughfare Hike plays. It's easily my favorite piece in the score, playing at such a desperate, unusual time for Henry, and it really helped make that part of the game stand out. Firewatch's visuals are also decent. Obviously, it doesn't look as beautiful as a AAA game like Horizon, but the art direction is strong and helped keep me focused and immersed, even when the frame rate started to tank and foliage popped in on occasion. So that's it for Firewatch, a phenomenal story driven by some frighteningly real characters and a tight script. If Firewatch interests you, I think it's absolutely worth a shot. I don't think you'll regret it. Xenoblade 2's Torna DLC is easily one of the best DLC expansions I've ever played to a game. It does so much to recontextualize what you know about the characters and the villains, and its ending is one of the best parts of the Xenoblade series. So when Xenoblade 3, my personal favorite Xenoblade and the #1 game on my 2022 tier list, was set to have a similar story DLC treatment like Torna, I knew it was going to be fantastic. And it was, but in a lot of ways I wasn't expecting. One of the major criticisms it seems people have of Xenoblade 3 is that it doesn't tie off the trilogy very well, being a self-contained story instead of a series finale. But what those people were really waiting for was the Xenoblade 3 Future Redeemed DLC. This DLC does a lot. Not only does it add more backstory and nuance to characters from the base game, it also ties in loose plot threads from the first 2 Xenoblade games. This DLC is not meant for anyone who hasn't already finished the rest of the Xenoblade series. It's effectively the grand finale to the trilogy, the culmination of the story started 13 years ago in the original Xenoblade Chronicles. But before we talk about the story, I want to address the gameplay. Future Redeemed takes the solid base of 3's gameplay and makes a bunch of interesting changes. Most notably, the class system from 3 is gone, meaning that the insane party customizability from the base game isn't quite there in the DLC. All 6 of the main party members have one defined class, and they can't switch their moveset around as freely as in the base game. However, that customizability has been expanded in other areas. The base game restricted which characters could form an Ouroboros pair for story reasons. Noah is always with Mio, Uni with Taion, and Lands with Senna. But in Future Redeemed, you can freely choose which characters get to partner up, with every combination having different skills and combos to try out, called a Unity pair. There's also the addition of the battle manuals scattered throughout the world, which can let you mess around with tons of crazy effects to pull off more insane chain attacks. The stuff you can pull off in this new system is absurd. It didn't even take a month of the DLC being out before people had already pushed the chain attack record beyond what was possible in the base game. In terms of the changes listed so far though, I don't know. They're cool, I guess, but I kind of wish the class system from the base game wasn't completely gone. I felt the customizability you got from that was a lot more straightforward, and I enjoyed messing with my party setup a lot more with that system than with the Unity pairs and the battle manuals. There are some more big changes outside of combat too. I think that in past Xenoblade games, the exploration element always felt a bit too disconnected from the combat, but they've finally rectified this disconnect in Future Redeemed in a variety of ways. Finding new areas has always awarded you with XP, but now completing your map also awards you with affinity points, which you can spend to unlock and upgrade combat arts and skills for your party. And this time, slots for your combat arts, gems, and accessories are locked behind items hidden in the world rather than by level, encouraging you to explore more of the map to get better at combat. These changes have finally addressed one of my biggest problems with Xenoblade gameplay, and I'm happy that the exploration and combat finally feel like they're working in sync rather than at odds with each other. Now, one of my biggest praises with the base game was how much high-quality side content there was. I unfortunately really can't say the same for this DLC. The side quests here are fine, but not nearly as good as those from the base game. Even then, there are a couple of standouts. The quest A Melody Sustained, where one of your party members is given a lute, is pretty cool, especially when you see her practicing at rest spots. So as far as the gameplay of Future Redeemed goes, it's a mixed bag. There are some great improvements, but I wouldn't say it beats out the base game for me. Spamming double spinning edge as Rex in combat and immediately dying because I attracted all the enemy aggro is really fun though. But the gameplay is just one thing. The biggest draw of Xenoblade to me has always been the story, and since Future Redeemed is the finale to the trilogy, my anticipation was through the roof. Ultimately, I think the story of Future Redeemed is really good. However, really good means that it's one of the weaker Xenoblade stories to me. The events of Future Redeemed take place centuries before those of the base game, focusing on a different cast of 6 characters. Matthew is the protagonist, a character related to Noah from the base game in some important ways that I won't spoil. Matthew is a lot more headstrong than most Xenoblade protagonists, bearing more of a resemblance to Ryan than someone like Shulk. And because he fills a different archetype, he gets to say some pretty funny British stuff, including
"I'm feeling full of beans,"
and
"Man, I'm freezing my balls off."
Matthew travels alongside a strange character who bears a striking resemblance to an important character from the first Xenoblade. Next up are Nickel and Glimmer, former soldiers freed from the endless war raging across the world, and who also happen to be the children of the final 2 party members, Shulk, the protagonist of Xenoblade 1, and Rex, the protagonist of Xenoblade 2. This is genuinely such a cool cast, with roots tracing from all over Xenoblade. A perfect group of characters for the series finale. Their interactions with each other are fantastic. It was wonderful to see how Shulk and Rex step into fatherly roles for Nickel and Glimmer, and I love the dynamic between Matthew and A. They frequently bicker like a married couple, and it's so funny to watch.
Lovely morning today. Perfect weather.
Wrong. This cloud cover practically guarantees rain.
Xenoblade 3 was ultimately a game about moving forward into the future rather than staying tied to the past, a theme that I think was expressed really well through its world and its villains. Future Redeemed attempts to add some nuance into that theme, showing the harm that can come in moving towards the future without first rectifying the problems left behind in the past. It was genuinely so interesting seeing this reversal of ideology among the heroes and the villains in this story. The ones pushing for change in the base game are the main cast, but this time it's the antagonist who wants to leave everyone behind in the past, to the detriment of nearly all life on Ionios. And yet, I still think this villain turned out to be one of the weakest in the series. His motivations never became clear, so it became hard to understand why he was at odds with the heroes in the first place. I do also think the massive scope of this DLC was a detriment to the story at points. There's one particular cutscene in the final hour that features a radio giving an insane lore dump of how the mainline Xenoblade series connects to Xenoblade X and Xenosaga, all while pivotal plot stuff was going on. The lore dump was cool, but I think it detracted from that scene in the way the stupid picture did from the base game's ending, information overload. The voice cast for this DLC isn't bad by any means, but I felt it didn't match the quality of the base game's voice acting. Still, it was great to hear Adam Howden back for likely his final performance as Shulk. And while Al Weaver wasn't able to return for a second chance as Rex, Fergus O'Donnell did a fine job taking up the mantle. Once again though, it was Harry McIntyre who stole the show, returning from 3 as this character. His screen time was limited, but his performance added so much extra nuance to what was already one of the best characters in the series. It's a shame he wasn't able to understand very much in his own playthrough of Future Redeemed.
Should have played the other games. Should have played the other games.
I am going to regretfully say that despite this series' history of great music, I will not be awarding a music medal to Future Redeemed, although it was absolutely a runner-up. With a few exceptions, all of the new tracks for the DLC are area and battle themes. And they're good area and battle themes, but since the cutscene themes are reused from the base game, there's not as much opportunity for the motivic storytelling that Yasunori Mitsuda's music had in Xenoblade 3. There are some great moments though. The new theme that plays for much of the Cent Omnia region of Ionios is fantastic, one of the best field themes in the series. Check this out. The theme as you're climbing up the Black Mountains is also fantastic. Listen to this crazy part from the night theme as you approach Prison Island. And although Mitsuda's contributions in this DLC were limited, the credits theme Future Awaits, featuring Xenogears singer Joanne Hogg, is such a perfect way to cap off the music for this incredible series. Future Redeemed ultimately didn't live up to the hype for me, but I can understand why it did for so many others. It's a reward for those who have stuck with Xenoblade Chronicles since the very beginning. Heck, it's a reward for those who have stuck around with Tetsuya Takahashi's work since Xenogears. I can't say I emphatically love it as much as I do the base game, but Future Redeemed is still an impressive expansion and conclusion to one of my favorite series in fiction. Whether Monolith Soft chooses to start a new Xenoblade trilogy or move on to something completely new, I know that whatever it is, it's gonna be great. The Last of Us Part 2 is perhaps one of the most controversial games in recent memory. Critics largely loved it, and it won Game of the Year at the 2020 Game Awards. But fans were very, very split. This sequel to one of the best games ever made does not play it safe in the slightest. The first Last of Us was phenomenal, a tale about rediscovering love and humanity in dark times. Apart from a few people hung up on the ending, the first game seemed to avoid controversy. That's not the case with The Last of Us Part 2. Story leaks before the game released had some furious with the story arcs of beloved characters from the first game. Those leaks, combined with some objectively valid criticisms about the insane crunch at Naughty Dog ahead of release, caused quite the stir in the gaming community. It seems this is the type of game you either really love or really hate, and I'm happy to say I really loved it, even if this game ended up being the most difficult to place on the tier list. The original Last of Us was all about love, how love leads people to bond and unite to protect what matters to them. The Last of Us Part 2 is the opposite. It's about hate, how resentment and obsession can drive a person down a painful road with no return. While the first game focused on Joel, it's Ellie in the driver's seat this time, as we follow her to Seattle in pursuit of the Wolves, a militia group that she feels has wronged her in some way. It all starts pretty tame on Seattle Day 1. Ellie, along with her girlfriend Dina, explore downtown Seattle in an attempt to find leads on where the wolves might be hiding. As the days progress, Ellie has to make some difficult choices about the lengths she'll go to get her revenge, and whether her goal is worth endangering those she loves. As the events in Seattle build to a climax, the game stops. Once again, the Seattle Day 1 title card comes up. And this time you start playing as one of the wolves, a woman named Abby. You now get to experience the same few days in Seattle from the other side of the conflict. Seemingly one-note characters that Ellie killed earlier in the game will be back, giving you an entirely different perspective on the events in Seattle. Slowly, you'll start to see why the wolves did what they did, and what that action ultimately cost Abby. This idea of intertwining Ellie and Abby's stories is so cool. Even if I knew the perspective switch was coming, the reveal was still awesome, and I love how we really get to empathize with every character, even if they're at each other's throats the whole time. Unfortunately, I do think this switch halfway through jostles the pacing of The Last of Us Part 2 quite a bit. It happens at such a tense moment in Ellie's story, when everything was heating up, and while it might work on an artistic level, I'm not sure pulling back all of the intensity to start over again worked for me personally. The events of Seattle have a satisfying ending, however I was kind of shocked to learn that there was still more to the game after that point. Sometimes it kind of felt like the game was meandering around and teasing a finale that had already happened multiple times. The pacing is something I really hope the HBO series fixes up when it adapts Part 2. I'm not sure if audiences will take kindly to Season 3 being entirely Abby focused, especially since I think her section of the game was significantly less interesting than Ellie's. Perhaps alternating Abby and Ellie's sections could help with that. I also think there are other things that the show might do better because it's a show rather than a game. The story in Part 2 doesn't feel like it was written for a video game with characters that you control. Perhaps there is something academic about the main character choosing to do things that the player doesn't want to act on, but it's incredibly frustrating when I begrudgingly go along with the character's choice only for them to change their mind later in a cutscene. Since a show doesn't have that level of connectivity between a player and the character they're controlling, this disconnect will be avoided entirely, and I think the story will benefit from that. Another issue I have with this story is how the third act is set up. It's caused by a conversation that I think was out of character for. That character had repeatedly been the voice of reason throughout the story, and I'm not sure why they chose that moment to say something so rash. It had me a bit confused. Now, my favorite parts of the first game, along with the HBO series, were Ellie's interactions with Joel and how their relationship progressed throughout the story. Since Part 2 follows Ellie away from Jackson, Joel isn't in this game too much. However, there are still plenty of great sequences with the two of them and how they both dealt with the events of the Firefly Hospital. Some of the best moments in Part 2 follow the evolution of their story in the first Last of Us, and I think their conversation at the end of the game, right before the credits roll, is perhaps my favorite 4 minutes of this series. It's so thematically and emotionally powerful, and rewatching it since beating the game has made me tear up on multiple occasions. I would be remiss not to mention Ashley Johnson, Troy Baker, and Laura Bailey's brilliant performances as Ellie, Joel, and Abby. Some truly world-class acting, of which this story would not work as well without. Even though I don't think the story is anywhere near as airtight as the first game, it still has some powerful moments. It tries to tackle a lot more, and while it doesn't always succeed, it still blows most games out of the water in the story department. A well-deserved silver medal. I gave the first Last of Us a lot of flack in last year's video on the gameplay side. I enjoyed the combat well enough, but it was those sections out of combat that really got on my nerves, filled with boring environments and puzzles with no substance. Thankfully, Naughty Dog made some big changes on that front that helped a lot. There's still a lot of pulling drawers open to find ammo and materials, but there are actually some interesting puzzles in the overworld that force you to use your brain. This one is my favorite. You need to get a dumpster from this building outside so Ellie can climb onto a ledge, but the gate closes unless you're actively holding it open, and you can't push the dumpster outside while also holding the gate. It had me stumped for a minute until I saw all of these signs around the room warning against putting a dumpster on the ramp. I had to do a double take here. Are you sure that was a puzzle from The Last of Us? Because that was actually pretty good. And there are more great overworld puzzles as you go, too. This one early on in Abby's section was a lot of fun. I ended the game wishing there were more overworld puzzles this time, since they really tapered off in the second act in favor of combat scenarios. Speaking of, combat in Part 2 also went through an interesting evolution. Ellie and Abby's playstyles contrast well against each other, with different guns, tools, and upgrades at their disposal. Even so, the combat started to tire me out a bit as the game kept going. Apart from a tense fight with Abby against I started to get a bit bored during her section of the game, especially as the story was at a bit of a lull. This is also a random complaint, but I wish that when enemies begged for mercy, they actually meant it. If you choose to spare someone, they'll go right back to attacking you as if nothing happened. I think the ability to disarm and spare people would have helped the themes of the story resonate more, especially when it comes to Abby's section. In the end, I was actually surprised how I was starting to prefer the exploration to the combat in some parts. One of my favorite segments of the game is when Ellie and Dina are exploring downtown Seattle at the beginning. The one time when you're given freedom to wander around and do whatever combat scenario or puzzle you want. I'm not advocating for an open world Last of Us, but if a potential future game happens to do something like this again, it'll be very welcome. Gustavo Santaolla's score for Part 2 is again resonant and powerful. It's driven by tender melodies from the ronroco, as well as the banjo, and Santaolla does a lot to expand on the motifs of the first game. By itself, the score for Part 2 is already astounding, but the game also features a lot of licensed music that works really well. Future Days by Pearl Jam is the game's anthem, with lyrics that match up frighteningly well with the events of the game. Joel singing it to Ellie at the start is such a beautiful moment, the first of many featuring Future Days throughout Part 2.
If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself. Everything I have found here, I'm not found by myself.
Again though, the music category was stacked this year, so we'll have to wait for more medals on that front. I will however give out a medal for presentation. The first Last of Us for a 10-year-old game still looks better than most of the stuff coming out these days, so it's natural that Part 2 is probably the best looking game I've ever played. The environment design is gorgeous, with nature reclaiming the urban jungles that once populated the United States. The character models are so lifelike, supported by incredible animators and performers that make them feel so real. You have to wonder why Naughty Dog even bothered with a remaster. This game already looks great, leave it alone and work on something else. And the sound design, particularly in the guitar sections, is so well done. This is probably the easiest medal for me to award. The Last of Us Part 2 deserves the gold presentation medal in spades. I said towards the beginning of this segment that this game was the hardest to place on the tier list. It's absolutely got merit. While the story isn't as impossibly great as the first game, it's still fantastic, even with its occasional faults. The gameplay is an improvement in many ways, but it still managed to drag towards the end of my playthrough. The music and presentation are both phenomenal. With all that in mind, I think B tier is an okay spot for Part 2, but don't think of that as average. If the first game is a 10 out of 10, this is still a solid 8. Don't let the naysayers scare you off. The Last of Us Part 2 isn't perfect, but it's a story that will challenge you in a way that few stories do, and that alone makes this game worth playing. A lot of crazy things have happened in Nintendo Directs, but who could have predicted that they had been secretly remastering one of the highest rated games ever made only to shadow drop it? After playing and really enjoying the 2D Metroid games over the past few years, I was already stoked to start the Prime series, and this remaster was the perfect excuse to dive in. Metroid Prime Remastered is an enhanced version of the GameCube classic, complete with overhauled visuals and a variety of control schemes to satisfy fans of the GameCube original, those who played it on Wii, and even Splatoon fans with gyro aiming options. Metroid Prime takes place in between Metroid 1 and 2, following Samus's quest to stop the space pirates from using the Metroid species to conquer the galaxy. Her mission this time takes her to Talon 4, a dying planet home to a derelict Chozo civilization that died of mysterious means. While it's a first-person game and it's a shooter, I don't think it would be correct to label it as an FPS and move on, because what makes Metroid Prime so great is exploration rather than combat. Talon 4 is an enchanting planet, with varied landscapes and a multitude of things to find, and I absolutely loved my time here. I don't know if the atmospheric element of Metroid has ever really resonated with me that much in the past, Even the strongest game in that regard, Super Metroid, wasn't able to immerse me as much as it could have because of gameplay frustrations. But it works so well in Metroid Prime. This game is so immersive. The fact that it's in first person for sure is a key factor, but the little details, like the fog on Samus's visor when she steps into a humid room, or the way her face reflects back at you when you shoot a missile, really add to the atmosphere. It's been a long time since I've really been able to just explore and willingly get lost in a Metroidvania, and the mesmerizing ambiance of Metroid Prime was really what allowed that to happen. It's also incredible how the original dev team at Retro Studios was able to translate the Metroidvania formula so well to 3D. There are a lot of upgrades to collect, from new concepts like the boost ball, letting you build up speed on half pipes, to returning favorites like the grapple beam. Admittedly, not all of them control as well as I was hoping. The grapple beam gets sent out pretty slow, meaning that it can be difficult to latch on to moving targets. And I wish the animation from first person to the morph ball back to first person was a bit faster. It felt annoyingly sluggish in combat scenarios. Samus also has access to a few different beam types with different effects. In the 2D Metroid games, you would only really have one beam that got upgraded throughout the game, but in Prime, you'll have to switch beams frequently depending on the situation. Certain doors can only be opened with certain beams, and the same goes for attacking particular enemies. I like this a lot. The combat in Metroid Prime isn't fantastic, especially when compared to Dread, but the beam switching keeps things interesting. The first phase of the final boss incorporates the beam switching in a particularly cool way. Apart from the beams, there's also something new to the Prime games, the visors. You can unlock these throughout the game, giving you new ways to assess your surroundings. The thermal visor will let you see life forms that might be hiding in the dark, and the X-ray visor lets you see invisible platforms. I think the visors are overall pretty cool. Some of the best sequences in the game are built off of them. However, switching them felt a bit unwieldy for me in combat, especially when the buttons are shared with the beams. On an embarrassing number of occasions, I would go to switch beams and accidentally switch visors, and the animation for switching them also isn't as quick as I would have liked. Still, I think the visors are used to great effect throughout the game, and they make for a good addition in the end. Another small issue I had was with the amount of backtracking in this game. In true Metroid fashion, every new upgrade meant it was time to assess my map to see where to go next. And it wasn't often a short track to get there, usually requiring a trip through Magmoor Caverns or the far reaches of Talon Overworld to get to my destination. There's also the matter of the endgame collectathon, where you need to solve riddles to find all 12 Chozo artifacts. Technically, you can collect these during your adventure without backtracking, but you have to explore the whole planet before you're allowed to read all the riddles. I wish they just gave them to you all up front instead of waiting for you to find the right room before giving you the clue. With so many tools at Samus's disposal, Talon 4 makes for a phenomenal playground to jump around in and explore. It wasn't long before I was hooked on Metroid Prime. It's so fun, and it was rough whenever I had to put the controller down to attend to real-world obligations. It may have seemed like I had more negative than positive to say on the gameplay, but truthfully, these are minor issues for me and a game that lives up to its status as one of the greatest ever made. Incredibly deserving of the Silver Gameplay Medal. Par for the course in most Metroid games, the story is minimal, but there's a lot more world building in Prime than most other Metroids. The Chozo of the past, as well as the space pirates of the present, have left lots of lore for you to discover across your journey through Talon 4. I was surprised to read that the space pirates kept pets, a detail that oddly helped to humanize them, even when they weren't the best owners. And when you learn that they've been trying to recreate Samus's arsenal, that's maybe the most interesting thing the space pirates have attempted in the entire series. Oddly, I think I ended up enjoying the random pirate logs and Chozo lore more than the actual story. The ending was pretty weak. You beat the final boss, which was sick, but there's no escape sequence, and the story ends just as abruptly as Metroid Dread. No debrief, no reflection on the events of Talon 4. The cutscene is extended by a few seconds if you collect enough items, and going for 100% nets you a post-credits scene setting up Prime 2, but I wish there was more to it than that. The music for Metroid Prime is iconic. There are so many good tunes here that set the tone for Samus's adventure, from the icy soundscape of Phendrana Drifts, to the terrifying Omega Pirate at the base of the Phazon Mines. And while the music is great, it's the visuals that steal the show this time. Yes, Metroid Prime is a 2002 game, but with this remaster, it stands among some of the best looking games on the Switch. The enemy designs look so alien and real. The way the HUD gets disrupted if Samus is hit with an electric attack looks so good. and the visual direction of the visors, particularly the thermal visor, works so well. If I have one complaint about the visuals, I wish the landscapes of Talon 4 looked a bit more alien. The Phazon Mines is really the only area that made me feel that way. This remaster looks so good, and I can only imagine how Prime 4 is going to look when it comes out in 12 years. Another silver medal for Metroid Prime Remastered. I'm kind of mad that Nintendo chose to release a remaster of only Prime 1 in 2023, because I desperately want to keep going. This game is phenomenal, taking all the best elements of 2D Metroid and translating them into 3D staggeringly well. As soon as the remasters of Prime 2 and 3 are ready, I'll be there, because my 15 hours in Metroid Prime are ones that I'm going to remember for years to come. Buckle up, because this section's gonna be a doozy. Ever since its announcement at E3 2019, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has been my most anticipated game for years. I'm a huge Zelda fan, and I still hold a lot of fond memories playing the previous entry, Breath of the Wild, for hours on end amid a less pleasant time in my life. The trailer from E3 2021, promising an expansive sky with a soaring, triumphant theme blasting in the background, filled me full of hope for this sequel to what was one of my favorite games of all time. But time passed and delays popped up, all without any new trailers or info. The name reveal trailer in the September 2022 Direct didn't inspire much confidence, and the trailer debuting Link's odd new vehicles in February 2023 was hardly satisfying. To add to my skepticism though, the next month I watched a friend play through Breath of the Wild for the first time. He didn't end up liking it very much, and unfortunately I was able to empathize with a lot of his criticisms. The story kind of sucks. If you isolate any one of the memories, you'll see that not many add anything meaningful to the plot. The combat, which is still great by Zelda standards, isn't fantastic. Weapon durability usually means that you'll put in more than what you get out of most enemy encounters. The world is kinda boring. Your reward for exploration is almost always a shrine or a Korok, and there's not much variety. While the game allows experimentation, it's rarely ever rewarded. You can do stuff like kill enemies by whacking them over the head with magnesis, but the amount of damage it does is paltry in comparison to your standard weapons. Oh, and the ending sucks. There's nothing of substance there, from a tame battle with Calamity Ganon to one of the worst sequences in the entire series, Dark Beast Ganon. What a letdown. Watching my friend's less than positive playthrough of Breath of the Wild, along with the lack of information about its sequel, and armed with the knowledge that the development time of Tears was the longest of any game in the series, let's just say I was having a difficult time staying optimistic for this game, even if the final trailer was admittedly pretty good. Yet, Tears of the Kingdom delighted me in its first few hours. The opening cutscenes were some of the most intriguing and epic in all of Zelda, setting the stage for a grand adventure. I loved the Great Sky Islands and all of the puzzles it presented. It felt so great to come up with my own ideas on how to get to the shrines and have my plans actually be effective. They're rewards that were missing from Breath of the Wild's open structure. And the combat felt fresh. I could take an awful base weapon and stick something decent on it to make it actually do damage. Taking on my first Flux construct was an awesome time, and I was immediately hooked back into Hyrule, despite my reservations. And then I dove into the depths, and my mind was blown. Somehow there was an entirely new map sitting under the old one to explore. My honeymoon phase with Tears didn't last forever though, and even though I really enjoyed it in the end, there are a few seams in this otherwise fantastic game. Let's start with the 3 map layers. First off, the land of Hyrule is reused from Breath of the Wild. There are changes here and there, a new town, a ton of caves, new Koroks, new quests, but I can't say that much here feels that novel. The world was the big focus in Breath of the Wild, but for the sequel, I can't say that the new overworld feels like much of an evolution, just refinements. But the reused ground layer was never the selling point of this game. It's always been the Sky Islands at the forefront of the advertising. They're on the game's box art after all. These were also pretty disappointing. There are a lot of islands to explore, but the most interesting ones usually turned out to be a skydive challenge or something for the story. Most of the islands are repeats of others, involving crystal escort missions to find blessing shrines. I was hoping for some sort of sky cities or civilizations or something, but nope. Once you're off the Great Sky Islands, there isn't much there. But if the Sky Islands are empty, it must have been the depths that took 6 years to make. Also, no. There's some cool stuff about the depths for sure. Learning all the ways the depths map relates to the overworld made for some awesome discoveries, but overall it's pretty empty. Most points of interest end up being Yiga hideouts that give you similar rewards every time, and the mines, some of which give you gear that's just amiibo gear from Breath of the Wild. Nothing new here. If the depths had new cities or quests or something, that would be great, but it's kind of devoid of stuff to do. And it doesn't help that everything down there looks the same. The overworld is helped out by its diverse terrain and ecology, but other than the area under Death Mountain, the depths lacks that same diversity. Heck, the underground levels in the new Super Mario Bros. Series have more diversity than this layer of the map, and that's really saying something. The sheer scale of these overworld layers is astounding, but unfortunately they're too big for their own good. I would have easily preferred smaller layers in favor of more dense and varied content between them. Not to say I didn't have fun in the sky and the depths, my 180-hour playtime speaks for itself, but I wasn't expecting to walk away thinking the main overworld was the best layer of the map, even if that one was also a bit of a letdown. The new overworld content wasn't the only selling point of Tears of the Kingdom. Link has a brand new set of abilities, significantly more versatile than the Sheikah slate in the last game. The star of the show is Ultra Hand, allowing Link to pick up objects and fuse them together to create working machines. This ability is awesome. I got lost for hours towards the beginning of the game creating stupid cars, flying machines, sand skimmers, and more. The versatility and freedom offered by Ultra Hand and the various Zonai devices is fantastic. Unfortunately, once you discover the legendary air bike, the novelty starts to wane away. This is easily the best build in the game, barely using any energy and moving you along a lot faster than most other vehicles can. Once you have a good air bike, you can trivialize a lot of things in Tears, even dungeons. I originally didn't want to cheese the game with it, but trying to explore the depths without one became a chore, so the air bike ultimately became a necessary evil. Another issue with Ultra Hand is its lack of combat potential. Sure, you can create funny autonomous murder machines, but the damage-dealing Zonai devices don't really get much done against the higher-level enemies. Late in the game, you unlock the ability to pilot this mech around, and the game puts a lot of obstacles in your path, including a Hinox. It took several minutes for the cannon on my mech to get the Hinox down to half health, at which point I just dismounted and finished it off in 10 seconds. If the Zonai devices just had better damage stats, I think this issue could have easily been avoided. Link has a few more abilities as well. Ascend is fantastic, allowing you to burrow through surfaces above you and emerge through the ceiling. If you can find a surface above you flat enough to activate Ascend, it can save you a lot of time looking for a way up, and it's a godsend in the newly added caves. Link also has the ability to rewind time on specific objects. This was the least interesting of the new abilities to me, but it still has its uses, allowing me to rescue any runaway contraptions that I had accidentally activated. There's also an unlockable ability called Auto Build, allowing you to instantly rebuild stuff you've already made in the past with Ultra Hand, a great quality of life feature. Link has one more key ability, but I want to save that for a little later when we discuss combat. A key part of Zelda games has always been the puzzles. In the past, puzzles usually had one solution, but Breath of the Wild's physics engine and focus on player freedom allowed for a bit of versatility in how you got shrines and dungeons done. That ethos is carried over and expanded in Tears of the Kingdom in several ways. First, the shrines. I think these are a large step up from those in Breath of the Wild. Most of these can be tackled in a variety of ways, and all that matters is that you make it to the end. I had a lot of fun with these new shrines, and unlike Breath of the Wild, I never felt any fatigue as I went through and completed all of them. Not all of the new shrines are winners, but the vast majority of them are pretty fun, and heck, some of them actually managed to stump me a little bit. I really love the Proving Ground shrines, forcing you to defeat a band of constructs without any of your usual weapons and materials. There are a lot of these, but each one has a special gimmick to keep things fresh. The dungeons have also seen a few changes. First off, they all actually look different, which is already a big step up from the Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild. I was disappointed by the return of the 5-terminal format. These dungeons don't hold a candle to the amazing linear dungeons of the past, like Twilight Princess's Arbiter's Grounds and the Sand Ship in Skyward Sword, but they are a refinement of the last game's ideas, and I had a lot more fun in these dungeons than I did in the Divine Beasts. Heck, the Fire and Lightning temples were actually really great. The dungeons in Tears are pretty easy to cheese a lot of the time with the airbike, rocket shields, or just climbing to your destination though. It almost feels as if there's too much player freedom. At least for me, engaging with the intended puzzle is usually a lot more fun than holding ZL with my rocket shield to boost up and activate a terminal. Tears of the Kingdom wants to give you the thrill of finding your own solution and sequence breaking things, but part of what makes the sequence breaks in games like Metroid Dread so fun is that they actually require a bit of skill and ingenuity. This is neither. Still, I ended up having a lot of fun with these shrines and dungeons, even if I had to turn a blind eye to the more boring solutions. I'll take cool physics puzzles over rocket shields any day. Link's final ability, Fuse, is the new mechanic in combat. The weapons in Hyrule have mysteriously degraded, but if you attach your materials to them, you can add durability, increase their damage, and maybe even cause some more interesting effects. Attaching a monster eyeball to an arrow will make it home in on enemies, and putting a muddle bud on your shield can cause attackers to turn on their own allies. Fuse instantly improved the combat for me. I enjoyed playing around with all the weird effects you can cause with all the items in your inventory. Admittedly, most of them are a letdown, just adding damage, but every now and then I'd be delighted to find something funny or cool I can do with my monster parts. The food system remains unchanged in Tears, unfortunately. You can still hold up to 60 meals that can instantaneously heal you during combat with no consequence. As a result, the combat lacks challenge, unless you decide to not heal in fights, therefore requiring you to nuzlocke your own playthrough if you actually want any challenge. I was able to have a lot of fun in some of these fights. Beating the floating coliseum with no healing and only 16 hearts was the most exhilarating moment of my playthrough. It's just a shame that I had to self-impose rules to have that kind of fun. Same with what I did in the dungeons by not using an airbike. I think severely limiting food inventory and making regeneration happen over time a la Minecraft would have been easy and effective solutions. Tears of the Kingdom also has a lot of bosses. Counting all elemental variations and the 5 returning overworld bosses from Breath of the Wild, I counted 26 different bosses, and I think they're largely pretty great. The Frox fights feel like refinements to the Stone Taluses, the Gleeoks make for heart-pounding archery battles, and some of the story bosses like Queen Gibdo actually pose a decent challenge. Every now and then there's a boss that isn't great. Muktarok in particular is pretty dreadful, and the Molduga fight from Breath of the Wild didn't age very well. Watch me kill this Molduga in 20 seconds by holding down the Y button. In the end though, I would say there are a lot more good bosses than bad ones. Colgera especially was a big highlight. If you killed this thing with arrows, you are very lame. Smashing through its weak points at terminal velocity made for one of my favorite boss fights in the entire series, and it was one of the times when this game really shined. Despite all my complaints about the map layers, the building mechanics, and the combat, Tears of the Kingdom is still really fun from start to finish. Again, I have 180 hours in this game. Hopefully that shows that despite these problems, I had a great time. It's a bit too flawed for me to give it a high ranking medal, but I think there's still something here worth celebrating in the end. So I'll give this game the bronze medal for gameplay. I feel like the story in Tears of the Kingdom is one of the strongest in the series, with a few caveats. There seem to be 2 recurring themes throughout this story. The first is cooperation, the necessity to band together to defeat a common problem. This theme presents itself best among all the settlements in Hyrule. In Breath of the Wild, Hyrule's denizens felt disconnected and disinterested in world events. The Zora were the only ones who made any attempts to stop their region's divine beast from going wild. But now things seem like more of a group effort. The Rito adults have bands together to gather supplies for their frozen village, and the Gerudo have been working to defend their settlements against the Gibdos threatening the desert. The theme of cooperation also extends to Link's new travel companions. I think it's super cool how all the dungeons and tiers are tackled with a partner, a la Wind Waker's Earth and Wind temples. Overall, I think the implementation of this motif throughout the game was really well done. The second theme of this story is sacrifice, the willingness to lose part of yourself in service of a greater goal. This theme mostly pops up in the memories featuring Zelda found around the map. I won't go into specifics here, but I really liked these memories. Unlike the last game, it feels like every cutscene in Tears actually advances the story forward. There's a bit of a problem with that though, since you can encounter these memories in any order. This story is clearly meant to be viewed sequentially, but the game makes no effort to enforce that, letting you spoil yourself on some pretty big twists. If you check out the walls of the Forgotten Temple, you can see the correct order to view the memories, but after talking to several others, I've only found one person besides myself who figured that out. Again, I feel that's another part in this game where there might be too much player freedom. Thankfully, the ending sequence to Tears of the Kingdom is fantastic. Ganondorf was a pretty flat villain, made a little better with some decent voice work by Matthew Mercer, but his boss fight was magnificent, leaps and bounds ahead of whatever the heck Calamity Ganon was, easily becoming one of the best final bosses in this series. And while the ending does undermine one of the best twists of the story, it ultimately left me pretty satisfied. Before music and presentation, a few more notes. Overall, the side quests are a big step up from Breath of the Wild. They tend to be worth your time in Tears, especially the ones labeled side adventures. Some highlights are the Great Fairy quests featuring the eccentric musicians of the Stable Trotters, this quest featuring a talking Kuko, and of course, Master Koga's questline. This quest sucks though, how did it ever get approved? Strangely, while the side quests seem to be a lot better in Tears, the shrine quests have suffered quite a lot. Breath of the Wild had a lot of varied objectives, but in Tears it's almost always a crystal escort mission. It also really bothered me that after you find a certain number of caves, Colton stops telling you where they are. I really wanted to explore them all, and I can't understand why the devs thought it was a good idea to cut the player off. Next thing, why do Zonai devices expire? Every time I built a contraption using a wing, it seems like it vanished not even a minute into its use. And this is also yet another reason why the airbike is great. It doesn't do that. And last, where the hell is Cass? Are you telling me this guy really ditched his kids 2 games in a row? And why does nobody even mention him except Penn? While Zelda has long had a history of great music, the new music direction from Breath of the Wild threw a lot of people off. It's less melodic and more atmospheric, letting the sounds from the natural world through over heroic fanfares. I've always appreciated the idea of the new music direction, but I thought the implementation wasn't that great. They could have done better than the odd piano plinks during the majority of gameplay, even though there were some pretty good melodic pieces in the villages and the dungeons. Unfortunately, Tears of the Kingdom recycles a lot of music verbatim from Breath of the Wild. Most ambient themes are the exact same, and while the new ambient themes for the sky and the depths are decent, it's unfortunate that they're the only new ambient themes we got. The town themes are also unfortunately the same. I love the Rito Village theme and all, but couldn't we have gotten something new? There's an alternate variation that plays before you complete the Rito storyline, but couldn't there also be a new track for after you clear the blizzard? Unfortunately, the blatant reuse of music really prevents Tears of the Kingdom from having its own musical identity. That being said, this is one of my favorite soundtracks in the series, heck, in any video game, and I want to explain why. First off, this soundtrack isn't safe. It would be so easy for a composer to look at this game, note that it's a high fantasy, and write a lovely score for a traditional symphony orchestra and leave it at that. But no, there are so many weird and unexpected elements in the music. Obviously, there's the saxophone seeping into the score, an uncouth instrument to be lending its sound to a fantasy world. The usage of electronics throughout the music of Tears also really impressed me. The battle against Miragia on Death Mountain might be the best example. I was not expecting this odd combo of synthesizers with world instruments and orchestra, and I love it. It's such a unique soundscape. That's all well and good, but the real draw of this soundtrack to me is its thematic and motivic material. To illustrate my point, check out this graphic I made, showing every single recurring theme in this score, from new themes in Tears, along with returning ones from Breath of the Wild and beyond. The music team found so many awesome ways to sneak in the musical themes of the game wherever you look. This topic is perhaps too big for the scope of this segment, which has already gone on rather long, but I do have a few specific quotations I want to share. First is the way Ganondorf's new theme appears in the main battle track. Finding this was a mind-blowing moment for me, and I want to share it. Next, while this quotation of Zelda's Lullaby is in a pretty spoilery cutscene, I want to share it because I got straight chills from it. Oh, and the Breath of the Wild theme is in here too. Last up, another spoiler cutscene, but this is one of the only times the theme from the classic Legend of Zelda plays in the game, and it's probably my favorite moment of the score. In classical music, Wagner is the king of leitmotif, with entire books dedicated to pointing out all the thematic material found in his operas. I genuinely feel like you could probably put together something similar for the music in Tears of the Kingdom. There's so much musical storytelling going on here, hopefully as evidenced by this graphic that took forever to make. And I didn't even get into the instrument symbolism, which I don't have time for, so I'll just flash this stuff up on screen real fast. Many may disagree, and I'll admit, I had my own reservations on this decision. But this score is so unique, so smart, so unexpected. Despite my criticisms, I think it absolutely deserves this year's gold medal for music. Hey, I forgot to write this in the script, but I can't believe I didn't mention the Colgera theme because holy shit! Last thing, presentation. Tears of the Kingdom is easily among the most graphically ambitious titles on the Switch, building off of its predecessor. The way the Sky Islands look at sunrise and sunset is so striking, and I love the visual design language of the Zonai, particularly the shrines. It's so impressive how you can traverse the 3 layers of the map without any loading screens, on a Nintendo Switch of all things. Game break, take notes. The UI visually looks a lot better than the last game, although it's a bit of a mess, particularly when you want to fuse something. Some custom sorting options would have done wonders. And of course, the way you use the abilities of your travel companions is pretty bad. They should have been bound to buttons instead of requiring you to walk up to them in combat. Still, I think the positives outweigh the negatives here, so Tears gets the bronze medal in this area. Over my 180-hour playthrough, I completed the main story, all 152 shrines, all 120 light routes, all 60 side adventures, all 139 side quests, found all 20 sages' wills, maxed out my energy cell, all 58 wells, and killed all 147 bubble frogs in every cave across Hyrule. So if it seemed at all like I was more negative than positive in this review, know that it comes from a place of love, because I played the heck out of this game. I loved Tears of the Kingdom, and it quickly became one of my favorite Zelda entries, even with its flaws. I walked away from this game feeling that I had a lot of fun while playing, and in the end, that's exactly what a video game should set out to do. Whoa, wait! Before we head into the final game, there's something we need to discuss. It's the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass. We got the second half of this pass in 2023, and as usual, it was great. Wave 4 started off incredibly strong. Nintendo only promised remastered tracks from past games as part of this DLC, but they surprisingly started dropping new courses and even new characters. This may be one of the only times where Nintendo underpromised and over-delivered on DLC. Their post-launch content isn't always so generous. The 2 new tracks this year, Yoshi's Island and Squeaky Clean Sprint, rank among some of the best in the series. They did such a good job with these. The city tracks from Tour also return, and while their quality varies, Singapore Speedway and Madrid Drive were some highlights from this year's courses. It seems they also listened to a lot of the feedback regarding the visual fidelity of the DLC. Compare a Wave 6 course like Piranha Plant Cove to a Wave 1 course like Toad Circuit. The difference is night and day. Something that isn't night and day though is the new version of GBA Sunset Wilds. Why did they add this track if 8's lighting system doesn't support the sunset that Sunset Wilds is known for? With that one little blemish though, this was another great year for the Booster Course Pass. Also, I really need to track down the composers and give them a high five or something. Mario Kart 8 continues to be one of the best soundtracks in gaming. The new arrangements of Moonview Highway and Wii Rainbow Road deserve special mentions, as well as the new tunes for Yoshi's Island and Squeaky Clean Sprint. Heck, even Sunset Wilds has a great remix. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe will no doubt go down as one of the best games in the series because of this DLC. The number of courses here is insane, too many to make a tier list of. Or is it? Okay, with that out of the way, it's time for the final game. Oh wait! We need to discuss the Mario movie. The knowledge that this was being made by Illumination inspired very little confidence going in, especially considering the unusual casting choices. But I was really delighted by this movie. It has almost nothing in the way of story, something that they better fix with the live-action Zelda. But it was still a really fun joyride through the Mushroom Kingdom. And heck, it was even pretty funny sometimes. Chris Pratt ended up being fine as Mario, and Charles Martinet's cameos made me very happy. Of course, Jack Black stole the show as Bowser. He absolutely killed it. If there were any weak performances, I would say it was probably the Kongs. Seth Rogen as DK and Fred Armisen as Cranky didn't seem to fit super well amidst a sea of, and this feels weird to say, good casting for this movie. Going in, I also wasn't optimistic of Brian Tyler's score for the film. He has a habit of throwing away established character themes in favor of his own. Check out his scores for Iron Man 3, Thor 2, and Avengers 2 for proof. But he pleasantly surprised me in this film. He didn't just quote the soundtrack from the original Super Mario Bros. There are references to Super Mario Kart, Dr. Mario, and Mario Odyssey, among others, even if Koji Kondo is the only composer credited. Strangely, this film uses a lot of licensed music from the 80s, replacing music that was clearly written for certain sequences. I would have much preferred Brian Tyler's score for this scene to Take On Me, no matter how much I love that song. That's a small blemish on an otherwise great time though. The Mario movie isn't great as a movie, but as an adaptation of the Mario universe in a new context, it was a ton of fun. Highly recommend. Alright, no more stalling. Let's talk about— oh no, wait! We gotta discuss the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. I'm just kidding. Let's jump into the final game on this list, one that truly deserves S tier all to itself. Outer Wilds is truly a one-of-a-kind experience. I'm going to warn you now, you can only ever play this game once. If you want the best possible time with this game, stop watching this video and start playing immediately. There's a reason why the Outer Wilds community has such a restrictive spoiler policy. That said, if you do choose to keep watching, I'll try my best to explain why this game is so great in the vaguest possible terms, even vaguer than the official marketing for the game. Outer Wilds is the crossover of a few genres. It's an open-world, space exploration, mystery game. You start on your home planet of Timber Hearth as the newest member of the Outer Wilds space program, preparing to explore the stars with a tool capable of translating the mysterious text left behind by an ancient civilization. The game gives you no direction on what to do. Grab the launch codes to access your spaceship, and you're off to do whatever you want. Traveling between planets doesn't happen in a menu like Starfield. You'll need to do the piloting yourself, which is a ton of fun. The game operates semi-realistically in regard to Newtonian physics. Certain planets have stronger gravity than others, limiting or expanding your movement options depending on where you are. And space is truly a zero-G environment, so you'll need to watch your velocity to avoid crash landing into any orbital bodies. Thankfully, the scale of the solar system in Outer Wilds isn't realistic. You can get from one planet to another in just about a minute, so you never need to commit to one planet for very long if you don't want to. What makes the gameplay of Outer Wilds so unique is that it's a Metroidvania but without any upgrades. You'll never find any new tools for your suit or your ship. Instead, your reward for exploration is knowledge. Translating ancient script might give you a clue on how to bypass an obstacle elsewhere in the solar system, or give you some information on the rules of this universe, which you might need because there's some real mind-bending stuff in this game. This is ultimately why it's so easy to spoil Outer Wilds. I could tell you that Super Metroid has an X-ray scope, but that means nothing to you. But if I gave you equivalent information in Outer Wilds, that would be tantamount to me letting you skip a major puzzle. This structure is so unique. I love the idea that everything is knowledge gated. Heck, if you know what to do, you can reach the ending in under 22 minutes, even though it's going to take a lot longer to figure out what you need to do to reach the credits. One other cool thing about Outer Wilds is how the solar system dynamically changes over time. For example, the Hourglass Twins have a special gimmick where sand is constantly draining from one planet to the other, meaning that the caves of Ember Twin start sealing up while the surface of Ash Twin is revealed. This means it doesn't just matter where you explore, but when you explore, adding an extra layer of things to think about as you work your way through the solar system. It's not like Bowser's Fury where you have to sit around and wait though. You can always take a nap at campfires to speed up time and wake up when you're ready. I love this mechanic. The way this solar system changes over time is super cool, even if I won't be able to share any examples beyond the Hourglass twins. The story of Outer Wilds is incredible, one that truly takes advantage of the interactive nature of games. It's designed for you to find it in any order you want. No matter what planet you start off on, you'll quickly start to find communications left behind from an ancient species. If you pay attention to their names, you'll start to discover a lot about who these people were, the different roles in their society, their different philosophies, and most of all, their thirst for exploration and willingness to discover the secrets of the universe. I particularly enjoyed following the journey of this character. Again, no spoilers. You're not the only living person in the universe though. The other members of Outer Wilds Ventures are spread across the different planets, each giving you a bit more background on the solar system, as well as sometimes giving you ideas on places to explore and hints for new puzzles. The story is very integrated into the gameplay in this way. Exploring more places gives you more information, which lets you bypass obstacles so you can explore even more places. It's a feedback loop. The gameplay and the story of Outer Wilds are in perfect sync, and both are fantastic. I've already gone over how much I love the gameplay, but the story is even better. Finally putting together all the disparate pieces of information together and figuring out the sequence of events that needed to happen for me to beat the game, that was maybe one of the coolest oh shit moments I've ever felt in any piece of media. And the brilliant ending is just the cherry on top. Every now and then there's a minor flaw where the gameplay and the story don't line up perfectly, but those are specks of dust in comparison to this incredible story, easily one of the best ever told. Since the story and the gameplay are so intertwined, I'm going to award these medals both at once. A well-deserved gold for gameplay, and an even more well-deserved gold for story. And I'm not done awarding medals to Outer Wilds yet, because it's time to talk about the music. The composer, Andrew Prowlow, has written one of the best scores I've ever heard. A lot of it is driven by banjos and guitars, giving much of the music a cozy feeling, like in the theme for Timber Hearth. But when the apathetic universe throws something unexpected at you, Prowlow gives you something equally cold and chilling. A cool bit of the Outer Wilds soundtrack is that a lot of it is diegetic. The other travelers of the Outer Wilds space program each have their own instrument, and the sound of their playing is actually how you're meant to track them down. If you can line the planets up, you can start to assemble a full ensemble. This music is pretty reliant on thematic material too. I'm not going to go into detail, but just know that Andrew Prowlow literally released an album of music featuring the themes of Outer Wilds well after his work on the game was done, just because he wanted an excuse to revisit those motifs. A lot of this music is more meaningful if you first hear it in-game, so I won't spoil it for you. Just know that the credits music is one of the best tracks ever written for a video game, a great top-off to a terrific soundtrack. Outer Wilds easily deserves this silver medal for music. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to break the streak of medals when it comes to presentation. Outer Wilds isn't the most beautiful game. The graphics are serviceable at best, even if the art direction is nice. Still, I kind of wish they had spent just a little more time in this department. Timber Hearth especially suffers from a lack of graphical fidelity. However, I do want to take a minute and just note the vibes. Most of Outer Wilds is deliberately designed to make you feel like you're on a camping trip. The first thing you'll likely do upon starting the game is roast a marshmallow. The designs of the planets are based on real-world national parks. For example, Timber Hearth is a combo of Yellowstone and Sequoia. And the focus on acoustic instruments like the banjo in the music feels like you could hear the soundtrack at a jam session around the campfire. The equivalence Outer Wilds draws between the wilderness and outer space is so awesome, and it creates a great vibe that also adds meaning to the themes of the story. There's more to explore here when it comes to Outer Wilds though. This story and this universe are tight. It's hard to tell how they could ever expand on the base game because everything fits together like a neat puzzle. However, the team at Mobius Digital created a DLC expansion for Outer Wilds called Echoes of the Eye that somehow found a way to build on the existing narrative and world. The game's director, Alex Beecham, puts my thoughts best.
How? And also why? And those are very good questions.
And yet, somehow, they did it. This DLC story is great. It adds a lot of nuance to the themes of the base game, and even solves a few lingering questions I had. The entire DLC takes place in one area, which I won't be showing at all, but just know that the DLC area is sick, as well as what you have to do to find it. Overall, the vibes are a bit different than Echoes of the Eye. The camping aspect is still there, but they also lean into horror a little bit, with the addition of a few stealth sections where you don't have access to your movement abilities. These admittedly frustrated me a bit, but in true Outer Wilds fashion, there are smarter ways to find what you're looking for than brute force, which I really appreciated. And all that frustration is worth it for the ending to this expansion. The final puzzle requires you to synthesize so much information together, and solving it leaves you with a phenomenal reward. And the music is again incredible. Andrew Prowlow came back swinging with a brand new set of tunes, many of which are referenced in his album of bonus content mentioned earlier. The devs really delivered on this expansion, and even though I can't share all the same praises for it as I can the base game, it's still better than most of the stuff I played last year. Outer Wilds is truly one of the best games I've ever played. It's smart, it's fun, it's existential, and finishing it left an aching hole in my heart, knowing that I'll never be able to play this game for the first time ever again. If you're curious, if you love the joy of discovery, you owe it to yourself to give this game a try, because I don't know if there will ever be another game that satiates those desires more than Outer Wilds did for me. And that's another year in the books. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. I wasn't intending on making this video so long, especially considering the reduced number of games from last year's tier list. If I make another, I'll try to tone it down a little. Here's a recap of all the medals I gave out if you're looking for any game recommendations. Now it's time for me to beg. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate your support with a like. If you didn't enjoy, feel free to leave an angry comment. I might pin it. Subscribing would also make me very happy. I get a shot of dopamine every time I see this number go up by 1, so please consider it. Alright, until next time everybody, catch you next year!